The big meeting room in space was very quiet until Ambassador Kira walked in. She was from the Veltan Empire, and her skin looked like blue crystal that shined in the light. Her footsteps made soft sounds on the metal floor as she moved to the front. Of the room, all the alien leaders sat in their special chairs waiting to hear what she had to say. Some of them had been fighting wars for hundreds of years. Others just watched and tried to keep peace between different planets. The room smelled like the special air they used for all the different types of aliens to breathe. Kira looked around at all the faces staring at her. Some looked worried, some looked angry. She knew what she was about to say would make them all very upset, but she had made up her mind. The humans have been invited to help us solve the big fight between our empire and the Roxan Federation. She said in a clear voice that everyone could hear. The room exploded with noise. Everyone started talking at once. Some aliens stood up from their chairs. Others started making angry sounds in their own languages. The peaceful meeting turned into chaos in just a few seconds. Delegate Hune from the Roxan Federation jumped up so fast his chair fell over his face, turned a dark red color, and his hands were shaking. He was normally a very calm person who never got upset, but this news made him lose control completely. "You cannot be serious," he shouted across the room. "Humans are babies in space. They only started flying to other planets about 100 years ago. They know nothing about our old fights that have been going on for centuries. How can they help us?" But Ambassador Tay from the Zephyrian Collective said what everyone else was thinking. He was known as the smartest diplomat in the galaxy, and when he spoke, everyone usually listened carefully. "Kira inviting humans to peace talks is the same as declaring war on good diplomacy," he said, shaking his head. "They are wild and unpredictable. They get emotional about everything. They do not follow any of the proper rules that we have used for thousands of years. This is complete madness." Skira had expected this reaction, but she stayed calm and spoke in her steady voice. "The human representative Dr. Wu comes with very good recommendations. Their species has solved many big fights on their own planet through new and different ways of talking. Maybe what we need is a fresh way of looking at this old problem." The chamber became even more noisy with debate. The fight between Veltan Empire and Roxan Federation had been going on for 300 years. Millions of people had died, and whole star systems had been destroyed. Traditional ways of making peace had failed over and over again. Economic punishments, military threats, and cultural exchanges had all been used to Lycians. A young Roxan named Bin whispered urgently into his boss's ear. "Sir, our spies tell us that humans do negotiations very different from any species we know. They use something called creative problem-solving and emotional intelligence in their diplomacy." "Exactly my plight," Han replied, making sure his voice was loud enough for nearby delegates to hear. "Emotions have no place in serious negotiations. This is going to be a disaster, and we will all suffer for it." Meanwhile, on the human ship that was flying toward the neutral space station, Dr. Wu was reading files about the conflict. Unlike other species who followed rigid rules and fancy ceremonies, he was preparing something completely different. His team had studied both cultures very carefully, not just their governments, but how they think, what they fear, and what they care about most. "Captain Nam." He called to the ship's commander. "Are you sure about this plan?" The other species seemed to expect formal, structured negotiations with lots of rules and ceremonies. Captain Nam was a veteran who had helped end wars on Earth. She had seen many peace processes and knew how to make enemies become friends. She smiled, but her eyes looked serious. "Dr. Wen, has humanity ever done things the way others expect? We ended our world wars not by having bigger weapons, but by understanding what each side really needed deep down. Let us show them what human diplomacy really looks like." As the human ship connected to the space station, word spread quickly through all the diplomatic areas. Species from all over the galaxy had come to watch what many believed would be a spectacular failure into a situation that had confused the greatest diplomatic minds in the galaxy for hundreds of years. Back in the main chamber, the debate continued. "Ambassador," Kira tried to explain her decision, but the other delegates kept interrupting her with complaints and warnings. "These humans do not understand our ways," said a delegate from the Arthurian Council. "They have not lived long enough to appreciate the complexity of interstellar relations there. Planet is still recovering from their own wars." Added another voice. "How can they teach us about peace when they barely know it themselves?" But Kira had done her research thoroughly. She had studied human history and was amazed by what she found. The humans had indeed been constantly at war for thousands of years. Their planet had seen conflicts that made the Veltan-Roxan dispute look small. But in just the last century, they had learned to solve problems without violence. Look at their recent history, she said to the room. They had weapons that could destroy their entire planet multiple times. They came close to ending all life on Earth. But instead of destroying themselves, they learned to talk to their enemies. They found ways to solve problems that seemed impossible. Delegate Hyun was not convinced. Their planet is tiny compared to the scale of interstellar politics. What works on one small world cannot possibly work across star systems, the young Roxanade. Bin had been quietly studying his datapad during the argument. Sir, he whispered to Hyun, I have been reading about human diplomatic successes. They ended something called the Cold War without firing a single shot. They helped enemies become partners. They seem to have a gift for seeing solutions that others miss. Hyun looked at his aide with surprise. Bin was usually very careful about offering opinions, but now he seemed genuinely impressed by what he had learned about humans. As the debate continued, in the main chamber, Dr. Wu was having a very different kind of preparation. He was not reading official reports or studying formal procedures. Instead, he was walking through the parts of the space station where regular people worked. He talked to janitors and cooks and maintenance workers. These people were not diplomats or government officials, but they were the ones who really lived with the effects of the war. Their families had been forced to leave their homes. Their friends had died in battles. Their whole lives had been shaped by a conflict that the leaders seemed unable to end. Wu believed that these regular people held the key to real peace, not because they had power or authority, but because they understood the true cost of war. They knew what really mattered and what was worth fighting. For they did not care about abstract principles or territorial pride. They just wanted safety and prosperity for their families. The formal negotiations were scheduled to begin the next morning, but Dr. Wu had no intention of following the usual script. He had learned something important during his years of studying. Conflicts, the most important conversations, usually happened away from the official meeting rooms. Real understanding came when people stopped playing their roles and started being honest with each other. As night fell on the space station, the different delegations retreated to their quarters to prepare for what everyone expected would be a long and difficult process. The Veltans reviewed their territorial claims. The Roxans studied their economic demands. The neutral observers prepared their formal procedures. But in the quiet corridors of the station, something different was happening. Human crew members were having quiet conversations with janitors and food service workers. They were learning the real stories behind the conflict, the personal tragedies that never made it into official reports. Captain Nam watched her crew work and felt a familiar sense of pride. Humans had a gift that other species seemed to lack: the ability to see past the surface of problems to the human heart underneath. Every person wanted the same basic things: safety for their family, prosperity for their community, and hope for the future when those needs were threatened. People fought when those needs were met. People cooperated. It was that simple and that complicated. The challenge was helping others see past their anger and fear, to remember what they really wanted. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The morning sun lights from the space station artificial systems were just beginning to brighten. When Ambassador Kira went looking for Dr. Wu, she expected to find him in his assigned quarters, studying official documents and preparing formal statements. Like every other diplomat in the galaxy, instead, she found him in the most unexpected place possible. The station's common area was buzzing with activity. Dr. Wu sat at a small metal table, surrounded by maintenance workers, janitors, and food service staff from both Veltan and Roxan crews. He was speaking in broken Veltan language with a janitor named A, who was excitedly explaining how the station's air systems worked. Dr. Wu, what are you doing? Confusion and alarm. The formal briefings begin in 1 hour. You should be preparing your opening statements. Learning, Wu replied simply, switching back to perfect Galactic Standard. Did you know that He here has been working on space stations for 30 years? He has seen the effects of this conflict with his own eyes. His family had to run away from their home planet when the fighting reached their star system. Kira looked around at the small crowd of workers who had gathered. They were all listening to the conversation with intense interest. These people were not part of the official negotiations. They had no authority to speak for their governments. They were just regular working people, trying to make a living. The support staff are not part of the negotiations, she said firmly. They have no power to make decisions on behalf of their governments. This is highly irregular and completely against protocol. No authority, perhaps, but they have something much more valuable: truth. Woo! Gestured to the workers around the table, these people live every day with the results of decisions made in fancy meeting rooms and government buildings. They understand the real cost of this conflict better than any politician. Word of the humans. Strange behavior spread through the diplomatic quarters like wildfire. Within an hour, every delegation knew that Dr. Wu was breaking every rule of proper diplomatic conduct. Hyun was absolutely furious when his aide brought him the news. "This is exactly what I warned everyone about," he shouted, pacing back and forth in his quarters. "The human has no respect for proper procedures. He is contaminating the entire process before it has even begun. How can we have serious negotiations when he treats this like some kind of social gathering?" But something very unexpected was starting to happen as news of Dr. Wu's conversations spread through the station. Junior members of both delegations began seeking him out. They were curious about this human who seemed more interested in talking to janitors than reading official reports. Young Velton cultural attaché named Sol was the first to approach him during the evening meal. She had heard stories about how humans had ended their own global wars and wanted to know if they were true. "Doctor, is it really true that humans ended their world conflicts through informal talks?" she asked quietly. "Our history books show that your species was constantly fighting wars for thousands of years. How did you stop?" Wu looked up from his simple meal and nodded thoughtfully. "We were always fighting, yes, but we learned something important. The most meaningful conversations often happen away from the formal negotiation tables when people stop performing their official roles and start being real human beings. Genuine understanding becomes possible, but we are not human." Sol pointed out. "No, but you are all people." Wu replied with a gentle smile. "You have families, hopes, fears, dreams. You want safety for your children and good futures for your communities. The uniforms and titles and fancy protocols are just costumes we wear to play our parts. Underneath all that, we are much more alike than different." Captain Nam observed the scene. From across the room, she had seen Wu work his magic before, but it never stopped amazing her. He had this incredible gift for making people forget they were supposed to be enemies within hours of arriving. He was already breaking down walls that had existed for centuries. "He is doing it again," she murmured to her aide. "Wu has this talent for making people remember their humanity, even when they are not human." By the end of the first day, the formal negotiations had not even begun, but something important was already changing. Delegates who had not spoken to each other in years were sharing meals together. Stories were being exchanged between people who had been trained to see each other as enemies. The rigid atmosphere of diplomatic protocol was melting away into something more natural, and Human Ambassador Tae watched all this activity with growing alarm. "This is complete chaos," he reported to his government through a secure communication channel. "The human has totally disrupted all standard procedures. At this rate, they will have everyone singing songs and sharing personal stories, instead of addressing the serious territorial disputes that brought us here." But other observers were beginning to see method in what appeared to be madness. A seasoned Velton diplomat named Yoon had been watching Dr. Wu carefully for hours. She approached Ambassador Kira privately that evening with her observations. "Ambassador the First have been studying the human diplomat all day," she said quietly. "He is not being careless or disrespectful like some people think he is, mapping the emotional landscape of this conflict. He is learning what each side truly values beyond their official negotiating positions." "What do you mean?" Kira asked. "Traditional diplomacy focuses on positions, what each side says they want," Yoon explained. "But this human is trying to understand interests, what each side actually needs to feel secure and successful. That is much deeper and more useful information." Meanwhile, in the Roxon quarters, Hyun was receiving similar reports from his own observers. His military advisor, a gruff veteran named Dae, had spent the day watching the human interaction with various station personnel. "The human is not just making small talk," Dae reported. "He is conducting intelligence gathering, but not the kind we usually worry about. He is learning about morale, civilian attitudes, the real impact of the war on ordinary people. This information could be very valuable for understanding how to structure a lasting peace." Yan frowned. "This is not how serious diplomacy works. We negotiate based on strategic interests, economic factors, territorial claims, not on the feelings of maintenance workers, but what if the feelings of ordinary people are more important than we realized? They suggested carefully, what if the reason this conflict has lasted so long is because we have been focused on the wrong things. As the second day continued, more and more people found themselves drawn into conversations with the human team. Dr. Wu seemed to have an endless curiosity about how the conflict affected real people. He asked questions that no diplomat had ever asked before. How has the war changed your daily life? He would ask. What do you worry about when you go to sleep at night? What would peace actually look like for you and your family? The answers he received painted a picture very different from the official reports. They wanted to go back to their home worlds. They wanted to trade freely and travel safely. They wanted their children to grow up without fear. Young people from both sides began talking to each other. For the first time in their lives, they discovered they had more in common than they had ever imagined. They liked similar music, enjoyed similar foods, had similar dreams for their futures. The war that had defined their entire lives suddenly seemed less important than the connections they were making. Saul, the young Velton attach, found herself in conversation with Bin the Roxanade. They discovered that both had studied art before being assigned to diplomatic service. Both had wanted to be teachers. Both had family members who had been affected by the conflict. We have been taught to hate each other our whole lives, Sol said quietly. But talking to you, I realize you are just a person like me, with hopes and dreams and fears. Bin nodded slowly. I always imagined Veltons as cold and calculating, but you seem warm and kind. Maybe we have been believing lies about each other. Wu watched these conversations develop with quiet satisfaction. This was exactly what he had hoped would happen when people stopped seeing each other as enemies and started seeing each other as individuals. The whole nature of the conflict began to change. Formal negotiations were scheduled to begin the next morning, but already the real work of peace building was underway. People were remembering that underneath all the political rhetoric and territorial disputes, they were dealing with real human beings who wanted the same basic things from life. Captain Nam joined Dr. Wu as he observed the evening social activities. Think it will work? She asked. It is already working, he replied. Look at them a day ago. They were preparing for another round of failed negotiations. Now they are discovering they actually like each other. The hard part will be helping their governments see what their people already understand. The second day ended with something unprecedented in galactic diplomatic history. Former enemies were making friends. The third day brought the first formal negotiation session that everyone had been waiting for. The Great Hall was set up in the traditional way that had been used for thousands of years. Each delegation sat at opposite ends of a very long table, with neutral mediators sitting in the middle. Formal protocols governed every single interaction and movement. Wu walked into the room, took one look at the setup, and immediately began moving the furniture around. What are you doing? Han demanded, his voice cracking with disbelief and anger. His composure that he had maintained for decades finally broke completely. Creating space for real conversation, Wu replied calmly as he pulled chairs into a circle. Hard to build trust when you are staring at each other across what looks like battle lines. This is absolutely unacceptable, Ambassador Tay interrupted, standing up from his chair. There are established procedures for interstellar negotiations that have been refined and perfected over thousands of years. You cannot just ignore millennia of diplomatic tradition. How well have those procedures worked for this particular conflict? Wu asked gently without stopping his rearrangement of the room. 300 years of war suggests that maybe it is time to try something completely different. Kira found herself in the very unexpected position of defending the human and his strange methods. Perhaps we should allow Dr. Wu to explain his approach before we dismiss it entirely, she said to the room. What followed was unlike any diplomatic session in the entire history of the galaxy. Instead of opening with formal statements of official positions and demands, Wu asked each delegate to share one personal story about how the conflict had affected their life or their family's life. The request was met with complete, shocked silence. Heian looked around the room as if he was searching for hidden cameras or some sign that this was an elaborate joke. This is ridiculous, right? He said. We are here to negotiate territorial boundaries, trade agreements, military withdrawal schedules, not to share our personal feelings like children. Actually, Wu said, pulling out a small recording device, We are here to end a war, and wars do not end with paperwork and signatures. They end when people decide they do not want to fight anymore. And people make that decision with their hearts, not their heads. Saul, the young Veltan, attached, surprised everyone by speaking first. My brother was killed in a border skirmish near the disputed zone 7 years ago. She said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaken slightly. He was a cargo pilot, not a soldier. He was just delivering medical supplies to a refugee camp when his ship was shot. Down the room fell completely silent. Even Han seemed taken back by the raw honesty and pain in her statement. No one had expected the session to begin with such personal revelation. I am very sorry for your loss, he said quietly, and even though the words were formal, they carried unexpected genuine weight, and sympathy. One by one others began to share their stories. Ben Hyan's aide spoke about entire villages on his homeworld that had been abandoned because of the constant threat of raids and attacks. Yoon talked about friends who had been displaced from their homes, careers that had been ended, dreams that had been put on hold indefinitely because of the war. What emerged from these personal stories was a picture of two peoples who had been trapped in a cycle of violence for so long that they had completely forgotten why they were fighting in the first place. The original dispute over mineral rights in a small, unimportant star system had expanded and grown into a generational conflict that was consuming enormous resources and countless lives on both sides. Now, Wu said after the last story had been shared and the room had fallen quiet, let us talk about what each side actually needs to feel safe and prosperous going forward. That is not how negotiations work, Tay protested, but his objection lacked conviction. Even he was beginning to see the logic and wisdom in the human approach. It is exactly how they should work. Wu replied patiently, when you understand what people truly need instead of just what they say they want, you can find solutions that serve everyone involved. Captain Nam, observing from the gallery above, watched as the human methodology began to take hold in the room. The rigid positions that had defined the conflict for centuries were starting to crack and soften, not through force or clever legal arguments, but through simple human connection and understanding. It is working, she whispered to her aide. He is actually doing it. The impossible is becoming possible. As the day progressed, something remarkable happened. The delegates began talking to each other directly instead of making speeches to the room. They started asking questions about each other's real concerns and fears. They began to see past the official positions to the human beings underneath. Han admitted that his people's main fear was not really about territory, but about economic security. The disputed system contained resources that his worlds desperately needed for their growing population, but he also admitted that the cost of fighting for those resources was bankrupting his government. Kira revealed that the Veltan Empire was not really interested in conquest, but in security. They had been expanding their borders because they felt surrounded and threatened, but the expansion was causing internal problems and stretching their military too thin. These were not the kinds of admissions that usually happened in formal negotiations. They were the kinds of honest conversations that happened between people who were beginning to trust each other. Young Soul raised her hand tentatively. What if we are fighting over the wrong thing? She asked. What if there is a way for both sides to get what they need without taking it away from each other? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything they had believed about the conflict. Wu smiled quietly. This is exactly the kind of thinking that leads to real solutions. When you stop seeing negotiation as a battle where one side must lose, you can start seeing it as a problem that everyone can solve together. Ben, the young Roxanade, had been taking notes throughout the session. Sir, he said to Hyun, what if the disputed system is actually big enough for both of us? What if instead of fighting over who owns it, we worked together to develop it? The idea was so radical that at first no one knew how to respond. Joint development of disputed territory was almost unheard of in galactic politics. Each species guarded their claims jealously, especially in resource-rich areas. But as they thought about it, the idea began to make sense. The system was huge, with multiple planets and asteroid fields. No single species had the resources to develop it properly, while also maintaining a military presence. To defend it, if we worked together, Kira said slowly, we could both get what we need. The resources would be shared, but there would be more total resources available because development would be more efficient, and it would be much easier to defend against pirates and raiders. Han added thoughtfully, a joint presence would be much stronger than either of us alone. The session continued for hours as this new possibility was explored and developed. What had started as a traditional negotiation about territorial boundaries had become a collaborative planning session for an unprecedented partnership phase. The day ended, the delegates were exhausted, but energized. They had covered more ground in one day than they had in years of traditional negotiations. More importantly, they had begun to see each other as potential partners rather than eternal enemies. Darwu packed up his simple recording device with quiet satisfaction. The real work was just beginning, but the foundation had been laid. When people started seeing possibilities instead of just problems, everything became different. The human approach was working. The fourth day should have been a celebration of progress. Instead, it brought the biggest crisis yet. Just as real peace seemed possible, terrible news arrived that threatened to destroy everything they had. A Roxan patrol ship had fired on a Veltan merchant vessel near the disputed border. No one was killed, but the incident sent shockwaves through both delegations. Emergency sessions were called immediately, and the familiar sounds of war drums began beating again. Han was absolutely furious. This is exactly what happens when we waste time on human touchy-feely nonsense. Instead of addressing the real military issues, he shouted at the emergency meeting. While we have been sitting around sharing stories and feelings, my people have been attacked by Veltan forces. The formal delegations immediately reverted to their old patterns of behavior. Accusations flew across the room. Threats were made. Demands for military action filled the air. The careful progress of the previous days seemed to disappear in just minutes. The trust that had been building crumbled like a house made of cards. The personal connections that had formed between individuals were forgotten as official positions took over again. Everyone retreated behind their government talking points and prepared for another round of failed negotiations. But Dr. Wu did something that no one expected. He stood up calmly and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Kira called after him with alarm in her voice. "Do find out what really happened," he replied. "Simply, anyone who wants to know the truth, instead of just arguing about rumors and reports, is welcome to join me." What followed was a masterclass in human investigative techniques. Instead of relying on official reports that were filtered through multiple layers of government bureaucracy, Wu insisted on speaking directly to the people who were actually involved in the incident. He used video communication technology to interview the crews of both ships that were involved in the shooting. The Roxan patrol captain and the Veltan merchant crew were brought into the investigation as real people rather than just names. In a report, the story that emerged was completely different from the official version that had caused all the panic and anger. The Roxan captain was a 20-year veteran named Jay, who had been tracking what he believed was a smuggling vessel. The ship matched the profile of criminal vessels that had been reported in the area for weeks. His orders were to stop and inspect any suspicious ships. The Veltan merchant was Captain Bach, who had been running his ship with all identification systems turned off to avoid detection by pirates who had been very active in the region recently. Several merchant ships had been attacked and robbed by criminal gangs. It was a terrible misunderstanding, Jay admitted during the video call, his voice heavy with regret and shame. Their ship matched exactly the profile of vessels we had been warned about. When they did not respond to our communication attempts, we thought they were trying to avoid inspection. Like smugglers, Captain Bach nodded with understanding. We have been running dark for 3 weeks because of all the pirate activity in the sector. We did not realize they were legitimate patrol vessels. When we saw them approaching, we thought they were the pirates we had been avoiding. The real revelation came when Dr. Wu asked both captains about the criminal activity they had mentioned. It turned out that pirate gangs from both sides had been exploiting the conflict for years, using the chaos and confusion to run smuggling operations and attack legitimate shipping. These criminals were making huge profits from the war. The more the two sides fought each other, the easier it was for criminal organizations to operate. The attack that had nearly destroyed the peace talks was a direct result of criminals taking advantage of the ongoing conflict. So, Wu said, addressing the reassembled delegations, "We have 2 honest ship captains who nearly killed each other because criminals have been using your conflict as cover for their illegal operations. The question now is, do you want to keep fighting each other, or do you want to solve the real problem?" The mood in the room shifted dramatically as the implications of this discovery sank in. Han studied the evidence that Wu had gathered, then looked across at Kira with new understanding. "These pirates have been operating in our space for how long?" he asked. "At least 5 years, according to the shipping reports," Kira replied, studying the data on her screen. will not pursue them into each other's claimed territory, and they have been attacking ships from both our peoples," Hyun added, as his anger shifted from the Veltons to the real criminals. Saul raised her hand tentatively. Could this explain why the border incidents have been increasing over the past few years, not because of military aggression, but because of increased criminal activity? The implications were staggering. Many of the incidents that had escalated the conflict over the past decade might have been the result of piracy and smuggling rather than legitimate military actions. The war had become a self-perpetuating cycle, with criminal elements actively benefiting from keeping both sides. Angry and suspicious, Captain J appeared on the video screen again. "Dr. Wu, I have been reviewing our patrol logs for the past 2 years. At least 60% of the incidents we investigated turned out to involve ships that were not properly registered with either government. We assumed they were military vessels operating under false identification." Captain Bach nodded in agreement from his own video connection. "And we merchant captains have been reporting strange ship movements for months, ships that appear to be military but do not follow proper protocols. We thought they were secret operations by the other side. This is what I mean about finding the real problems," Wu said quietly to the assembled delegates. "Sometimes the people you think are your enemies are actually just caught in the same trap that you are. The real enemies are the ones who profit from keeping you fighting." The evidence was overwhelming. Criminal organizations had been deliberately stirring up incidents between the two sides. Every time tensions increased, their operations became more profitable. Every escalation in the conflict created more opportunities for illegal activity. "We have been played," Han said slowly, the full realization hitting him. "We have been dancing to the tune of criminals who wanted us to keep fighting each other." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this shocking revelation. The ancient conflict that had consumed their civilizations for 3 centuries had been manipulated and prolonged by criminal gangs who cared nothing for territory or honor or justice. They just wanted both sides angry and distracted so they could steal and smuggle and attack innocent people. While the military forces were focused on fighting each other, Wu looked around the room at the faces of people who were seeing their conflict in a completely new light. The human approach had revealed something that traditional diplomacy had completely missed. The war had evolved far beyond its original causes. Now the question was what they were going to do about it. The 5th day brought a completely different kind of negotiation session. Instead of arguing over territory and trade routes, the delegations found themselves planning joint military operations against the criminal networks that had been exploiting their conflict for years. "I still cannot believe we missed this completely," Yoon said, shaking her head as she reviewed intelligence reports that painted a picture of massive criminal activity. "Ignored the real threat that was right in front of us. That is exactly what the criminals were counting on," Captain Nam observed from her position as military advisor. "While you were preparing for war with each other, they were getting rich off your conflict. Every escalation made them more money." The evidence was overwhelming. Criminal gangs had been operating in the disputed zones for years, using the lack of cooperation between Velton and Roxan forces as perfect cover. Their operations included smuggling weapons, selling stolen goods, kidnapping civilians for ransom, and attacking merchant vessels from both sides. Darwu presented his proposal to the assembled delegates. Joint patrols, shared intelligence, coordinated response to piracy and smuggling. You do not have to love each other, but you can work together against common enemies who are hurting both your peoples. The reaction was surprisingly positive. Hyun, who had been the most resistant to human methods from the beginning, was now one of the strongest advocates for cooperation. "These criminals have been using our hatred against us," he said with growing anger. "Every time we escalated tensions, they got richer and bolder." But the real breakthrough came when Wu suggested something even more radical than joint military operations. He proposed a joint colony in the disputed star system that had been the original cause of the war. "You are both claiming this system because of its mineral wealth," he explained, "but neither of you has the resources to properly develop it while maintaining the military presence needed to defend it. What if you developed it together, as equal partners?" The silence that followed was deafening. Joint colonization was completely unprecedented in galactic history. Species guarded their territorial claims more jealously than anything else, especially in resource-rich systems. The idea of sharing development was almost unthinkable. "It is impossible," Tay said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried in previous objections. "The logistics alone would be a nightmare. There are no procedures for joint colonial administration. Actually, Ben said, surprising everyone in the room, our economic analysts have been studying this system for decades. The development costs have been the main barrier to full exploitation. If we shared those costs between our two governments, we could both profit more than either of us could achieve alone. Kira finished her crystalline features, reflecting growing excitement as she saw the possibilities. The mathematics were compelling. A joint colony would be more defensible against pirates, more economically efficient, and would require both species to maintain peaceful relations to protect their mutual investment. The system contained enough resources to make both peoples wealthy if they worked together. There is another benefit, Sol added. Quietly, my brother died fighting over this system. If Veltans and Roxans were working together there, living together, building something positive together, then his death would have real meaning, instead of being just another casualty in a pointless war. The emotional weight of that statement settled over the room like a blanket. This was not just about economics or territory anymore. It was about transformation, about choosing to build something instead of destroying it, about turning centuries of hatred into cooperation. The criminals will not like this, Hian observed, with satisfaction. Joint operations will eliminate their safe havens. A joint colony will bring permanent security to the entire region. They will fight against this agreement, which is exactly why they have been working so hard to keep us fighting each other, Wu replied. Every escalation in your conflict has been money in their pockets. Every failed peace negotiation has meant more opportunities for their illegal operations. The day progressed. The impossible began to seem not only possible, but inevitable. Technical committees were formed to study the joint colony proposal. Intelligence services began sharing classified data about criminal networks. For the first time in centuries, military commanders started planning coordinated patrol schedules. The war that had defined both species for 300 years was ending, not with conquest or surrender, but with partnership against common enemies who had been manipulating both sides for their own profit. Captain J, the Roxin patrol commander, whose misunderstanding had nearly derailed the peace process, appeared on screen again. Dr. Wu, I want to volunteer my ship and crew for the first joint patrol. We have been fighting the wrong enemy for too long. Captain Bach, the Velton merchant, whose ship had been attacked, nodded in agreement. My cargo routes go through the disputed zones every month. I can provide intelligence about criminal activity that our governments never knew about. Young people from both delegations were already making plans for the joint colony. Sol and Bin had discovered they both had engineering backgrounds and were discussing technical challenges of building settlements that could accommodate both species. We will need to design cities that work for both our peoples, Sol said excitedly. Different atmospheric requirements, different social structures, different cultural needs. It will be the most complex engineering project in galactic history, but also the most important one, Bin replied. If we can make this work, it will prove that different species can not only coexist, but thrive together. It could be a model for the entire galaxy. Dr. Wu watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. The human approach had not only ended a centuries-old conflict, but was creating something entirely new, a partnership that could serve as an example for other species who thought cooperation was impossible. The criminal networks that had profited from the war were already feeling the pressure joint intelligence operations had identified. Major smuggling routes and pirate bases within hours. The announcement of the partnership agreement was causing panic in criminal organizations. Across the sector, we have them on the run, Han reported, with grim satisfaction. Our combined intelligence, NETWORKS, have uncovered criminal operations that neither of us could have found alone. They relied on our lack of communication to hide their activities. The joint colony proposal had evolved into something even more ambitious. The Velton-Roxin development consortium would not only exploit the disputed systems, resources, but would serve as a center for interspecies cooperation and research. We are not just ending a war, Kira observed as she reviewed the preliminary agreements. We are creating a completely new kind of relationship between species. This could change everything about how the galaxy approaches conflict resolution. The fifth day ended. Both delegations were working frantically to finalize details of agreements that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. The transformation was remarkable. People who had been preparing for another round of failed negotiations were now planning a shared future. Dr. Wu stood at the observation window, watching ships from both fleets conduct their first Joint training, exercised the sight of former enemies working together as partners, was something that would have been impossible under traditional diplomatic methods. Captain Nam joined him at the window. "Think it will last?" she asked. "She has tit, has too," he replied. "The alternative is going back to a war that benefits no one except criminals. Both sides have seen what cooperation can accomplish. They will not want to give that up. The human solution was working better than anyone had dared to hope." The final day of negotiations was unlike anything in the entire history of galactic diplomacy. Instead of signing a simple peace treaty that would end the war, the delegations were creating partnership agreements that would completely transform the relationship between their people's ambassador T.A., who had been the most skeptical of human methods from the very beginning, found himself documenting the entire process for the Galactic Council archives. "I must admit," he said to Dr. Wu, "your approach has achieved something that centuries of traditional diplomacy could never accomplish. It is not magic," Wu replied humbly. "It is just recognizing that people are people, whether they are human or Veltan or Roxan, or any other species. Everyone wants the same basic things: safety for their families, prosperity for their communities, and meaning in their lives. When you start from that understanding, real solutions become possible." The joint colony proposal had grown into something far more ambitious than anyone had originally imagined. The Veltan-Roxan Development Consortium would not only develop the disputed systems, valuable resources, but would serve as a model for interspecies cooperation throughout the entire galaxy. "We are not just ending a 300-year war," Kira observed as she reviewed the final documents. "We are creating an entirely new kind of relationship between different species. This could change how the whole galaxy thinks about conflict and cooperation." The criminal networks that had secretly profited from the conflict for decades were already feeling enormous pressure. Joint intelligence operations had identified and shut down major smuggling routes. Within just 2 days, the announcement of the partnership agreement had caused complete panic in criminal organizations that had relied on the war for their illegal profits. Captain J, the Roxan patrol commander, whose terrible misunderstanding had nearly destroyed the peace talks, was present for the final signing ceremony. "Dr. Wu," he said with deep emotion, "I want to thank you for helping us discover the truth. I could have killed innocent people because I was so focused on fighting the wrong enemy." Captain Bach, the Veltan merchant whose ship had been attacked, nodded in strong agreement. "The real enemy was never each other. It was the criminals who wanted us to keep fighting so they could profit from our hatred." And Firaz, the formal documents were signed representatives from dozens of species throughout the galaxy watched in complete amazement through live video feeds. The human approach to diplomacy had not only ended one of the longest-running conflicts in galactic history, but had created a framework for cooperation that could be applied to other disputes across the galaxy. "You know," Han said to Wu during the celebration feast that followed, "when I first heard that humans were coming to mediate our conflict, I thought it was some kind of elaborate joke. I told everyone that inviting humans to peace talks was the same as declaring war on diplomacy itself." "And what do you think now?" Wu asked with genuine curiosity. "Now I think maybe diplomacy needed exactly that kind of war," Hien replied thoughtfully. "A war against the old ways of doing things, a war against the assumption that conflict between different peoples is inevitable, a war against the idea that different species cannot work together for mutual benefit." The celebration continued late into the artificial night, with Veltans and Roxans sharing meals and stories, planning joint projects, and discussing new partnerships. The rigid protocols that had defined their relationship for centuries had been completely replaced by something more flexible and more human. Captain Nam watched from the observation deck as the combined fleets of both species prepared for their first official joint patrol against the criminal networks that had exploited their conflict for so long. "Think this new partnership will really work?" she asked. "Dr. Witt is already working," he replied, pointing to the scene below them. "Look at what has happened in just 6 days a week ago. They were preparing for another round of warfare. Now they are planning to build a future." Together, the human diplomatic team prepared to depart the space station, but their impact would be felt for generations to come. The Veltan-Roxan partnership became a model that other species studied and adapted. The human methods of focusing on personal connections, understanding real needs rather than stated positions, and creative problem-solving were copied throughout the galaxy. Young people like Sol and Bin, who had discovered friendship across enemy lines, were already making plans to attend each other's universities and work together on the joint colony project. The next generation would grow up seeing cooperation as normal rather than conflict as inevitable. As their ship pulled away from the space station, Dr. Wu reflected on the events of the past week. The other species had been absolutely right about one thing: inviting humans to the peace talks had indeed been a declaration of war, but it had been a war against hatred, against the assumption that different peoples could not understand each other, against the idea that conflict was the natural state of relations between species. It had been a war against cynicism and despair, and the belief that some problems were simply unsolvably in humanity, as it had done so many times before, had won that war not through superior weapons or clever tricks, but through the simple revolutionary act of treating everyone else as people worth understanding and respecting. The joint patrols were already reporting success in their operations against criminal networks. Pirates and smugglers, who had operated freely for years, were being arrested or driven out of the region. The same cooperation that was bringing peace was also bringing security and prosperity. Wu received a final message from Sol, who is already working on preliminary designs for the joint colony. "We are calling it New Hope Station," she wrote. "The first city in galactic history designed from the beginning for multiple species to live and work together as equals." Captain Nam smiled as she read the message over his shoulder. "New Hope seems like the perfect name." Dr. Wu nodded as he watched the stars through the ship's viewport. The galaxy was a big place with many conflicts and many opportunities for misunderstanding, but if two species could end a 300-year war and become partners, then anything was possible. The human approach had proven that the most powerful force in the universe was not military might or economic pressure or political manipulation. It was the simple recognition that beneath all the differences of species and culture and history, everyone wanted the same fundamental thing: safety for their loved ones, hope for the future, the chance to build something better than what came before. When people remembered those shared desires, peace became not just possible, but inevitable. The galaxy would never be quite the same, and that was exactly what it needed. The war was over, the partnership had begun, and somewhere in the disputed system that had caused so much suffering, construction crews from both species were already breaking ground for New Hope Station, where former enemies would live and work together as friends. The human gift to the galaxy was not technology or weapons or wealth. It was the radical idea that understanding each other was not only possible, but was the key to solving every other problem they faced. That gift would keep giving for generations to come.